from our studios here in the national capital, styled exclusively by none other than Paul Mall, ladies and gentlemen. At the same time, let me tell you that we have an expansive list of stories to cover. The Prime Minister, he's yet again for the 10th consecutive time celebrating Diwali on the border front with the Jawans. At Deepotsav 2023, India's yet again made another world record, literally illuminating the Guinness Book of World Records, as it were. Some international top developments that shouldn't be missed by you today. And even as we're talking about Diwali, climate change is something that we're going to focus on as well. Delhi AQI and what's happening in the rest of the world as well. But first and foremost, day 37, updates from the war front in that conflict-ridden region of West Asia, Israel versus Hamas. The following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well-being. Well, it's day 37 of the Israel-Hamas conflict. There's no end to the fighting. Diplomacy is going on in various sectors across the world. Meanwhile, this is the latest that we're tracking for you. Day 37. 11,078 Palestinians and 1,200 Israelis have been killed amid this conflict. 4,506 children have been killed in Gaza. That means 1 every 10 minutes on average. 46 Israeli Defense Forces soldiers have been killed in that expansive ground operation that continues across the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, 247 Israelis, soldiers and civilians alike, are being held hostage in Gaza. More than 570 aid trucks have been let inside the Gaza Strip so far. That is still a minuscule number. This even as Arab and Muslim leaders and nations demand immediate end for the Gaza war. On the other hand, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he's yet again pushed back against an international call for a ceasefire. This even as Iran, in that Riyadh summit, called on Islamic nations to designate Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, as a terrorist organization. Pro-Palestinian protests are shaping up across Europe and America. In Scotland, people are getting on top of the Scottish Parliament. In London, people are hitting the roads. The same is the story in America as well. Meanwhile, in India, trade unions have asked the centre to scrap the deal to send Indian workers to Israel because, well, Palestinians are certainly going to be kicked out of Israel. That's the big word that has in fact come out. Now, talking about that major Riyadh summit, leaders at the Arab League and the OIC joint summit hosted by Saudi Arabia have called for an end to the war in Gaza. They also rejected justifying Israel's actions against Palestinians as self-defense. The summit has condemned, quote-unquote, Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip and termed the actions of the Israeli army as war crimes, as barbaric, and as inhuman massacres. Now, at the beginning of the summit, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said that the kingdom, quote-unquote, holds the Israeli authorities responsible for the crimes committed against Palestinian people.
We are witnessing a humanitarian catastrophe that demonstrates the failure of the Security Council and the international community to put an end to the flagrant Israeli violations of international laws and norms and international humanitarian law. It confirms the double standards and selectively in its application. What future do I speak of when Gaza is being destroyed? Every hour, tens of people die. What future do they want us to talk about? The only future that we can talk about, and this is the unifying position of the Arab and Islamic countries, is an immediate ceasefire.
Meanwhile, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, who is on his first trip to Saudi Arabia since the two countries mended ties back in March, called upon the Islamic countries to designate the Israeli army as a terrorist organization.
Undoubtedly, the US government is the commander and the main accomplice of the crime. Both the war machines of the Zionist regime and its fuel belong to the Americans. Cutting any sort of political or economic relations with the Zionist regime by the Islamic countries. In this regard, trade boycott against the Zionist regime, especially in the energy field, should be prioritized. Islamic governments should designate the army of the occupying and aggressor regime as a terrorist organization.
Now, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he renewed his call for an immediate ceasefire and said that Israel was taking revenge on Gazan babies, children and women.
We are faced with a barbarism unprecedented in history, where hospitals, places of worship, schools and refugee camps, ambulances are bombed and civilians are massacred. According to the UN, in Gaza and Ramallah, 12,000 Palestinians have been killed and 73% of them were women and children.
Well, now the final declaration of the summit also called upon the United Nations Security Council to adopt a decisive and binding resolution to halt Israel's aggression. Even as we're looking at all these visuals, Palestinian Authority president over there, who was also called upon this particular meet. The declaration also called for an end to weapons sale to Israel and dismissed any kind of future political resolution to the conflict that would keep Gaza separate from the West Bank area. Now, the summit, however, also brought out the differences which exist among the Arabic countries as well. 4 Arab countries rejected a proposal which called for prohibiting the use of American and other military bases located in Arab countries to supply Israel with weapons and ammunition and other material. The names of these 4 countries that rejected the proposal have not been disclosed as of yet, but the differences, of course, coming out in the open. At the same time, again, interesting and important to note that several nations in the grouping also rejected responding to Israel's actions by disrupting oil supplies and by severing economic and diplomatic ties with Israel. Israel has till now rejected all calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that the Israeli forces will continue their operation in Gaza with full force. Now, the Israeli military has said that it will help in evacuating babies who are trapped in Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital, one of the biggest medical facilities in the Gaza Strip. This after several international humanitarian organizations called upon the Israeli government to cease the unrelenting assault on Gaza's health system.
Thousands of people seeking safety in southern Gaza fled the enclave's main hospital on Saturday as fighting continued in the area for the second day. This man says he lost his son in gunfire and that he had to keep moving, leaving his body at the site.
It's more of a war zone here. It's continuous bombardment for more than 24 hours.
Speaking to Reuters by phone, Palestinian senior plastic surgeon Dr. Ahmed al-Mokhalalati said most of the hospital staff and people sheltering at Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa, had left, but 500 patients were still there. A Palestinian health ministry spokesman said Israeli shelling had killed a patient in intensive care, and fighting was limiting people's ability to move. Palestinian officials said 2 babies had died and dozens more were at risk after fuel ran out on Saturday. At a news conference, Chief Israeli military spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said the military will help evacuate babies trapped there. In this video released by the Israeli army, defense official Colonel Moshe Tetro says there are clashes between Israel Defense Forces troops and Hamas operatives around the hospital, but the Israeli military denied endangering it. Israel said earlier that doctors, patients, and thousands of evacuees who have taken refuge at the hospitals in northern Gaza must leave so it can tackle Hamas gunmen who it says have placed command centers under and around them. Hamas denies using hospitals in this way. Meanwhile, Hamas said it had completely or partially destroyed more than 160 Israeli military targets in Gaza, including more than 25 vehicles in the past 48 hours. But an Israeli military spokesperson said Hamas had lost control of northern Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeated in a press conference on Saturday his aim that Israel take security control over Gaza for an indefinite period, saying we won't stop until the mission is completed. Dr. Rick Brennan, the regional emergency director of the World Health Organization, says the situation is desperate.
50% of those hospitals are non-functioning right now. Those that are functioning are working well below their capacity because of a lack of fuel, a lack of medicines, a lack of water and necessary medical supplies. Doctors, nurses are completely exhausted and overwhelmed, and a number of the hospitals are under attack.
As the humanitarian situation worsened, Gaza's border authority announced that the Rafah land crossing into Egypt would reopen on Sunday for foreign passport holders after being closed on Friday.
Humanitarian aid that's not trickling in. Hope is diminishing, and at the same time, a child is killed on average every 10 minutes in the Gaza Strip. This, according to World Health Organization Director General Jeff Tedros, who told the same to the United Nations Security Council. He said that half of Gaza's 36 hospitals and 2/3 of its primary healthcare centers were not functioning, and those that were operating were way beyond their capacities, describing the healthcare system as being on its knees.
Tens of thousands of displaced people sheltering at hospitals, families crammed into overcrowded schools, desperate for food and water. More than 10,800 people have now been killed in Gaza, almost 70% of them women and children. On average, a child is killed every 10 minutes in Gaza. 1.5 million people have been displaced and are looking for shelter anywhere they can find it, but nowhere and no one is safe.
Meanwhile, until about 10 days ago, Tom Hand, an Israeli, believed that his daughter had been killed in attacks by Hamas gunmen on the 7th of October's assault, based on unofficial information that he had received. But on October 31st, the Israeli army confirmed that his daughter had not been identified as one of the people killed in Kibbutz Be'eri, and they believed she was still alive and in Gaza. Take a look at this next report as mourning here has turned into hope and relief into anxiety.
Unofficial reports came in that she was found dead in the kibbutz. Like I say, it was unofficial. I was relieved. I was relieved that she was dead and it was all over. It would have been pretty quick. Now I know she's in Gaza and she's alive. She's going to be 9 in the tunnels, which will be a lovely birthday party for her. She won't even know it's her birthday. She'll have no idea of night or day or time. So yeah, there'll be no birthday party, no birthday cake, no friends around. But now we hope, now we pray, because we know she's alive. You have to completely switch your head around 180 degrees and think, okay, we're going to get her back. We're going to get her back. We're going to get them all back. No matter when we get her back, we'll have the biggest birthday party the world has ever seen.
Meanwhile, Israeli forces fought the Hamas terrorists and inched their way closer to the 2 big hospitals in northern Gaza as the plight of civilians in the besieged Palestinian territory worsened. Many continued to flee the embattled north to the south. According to the IDF, they say more than 1 lakh people fled the northern part of the Gaza Strip to the south within a span of 48 hours.
Smoke rises behind Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. In the courtyard and corridors are thousands of displaced people. At the gates, body bags. Israeli forces fought Hamas militants among ruined buildings in the north of the Gaza Strip on Thursday, inching their way closer to Al-Shifa and another main hospital in Gaza City. In the emergency room, this man says he and others tried to head south, but when they reached the road, a tank fired at them. Others fled along a frontline route. The White House said on Thursday Israel has agreed to pause operations in northern Gaza for 4 hours a day from Thursday, the first sign of respite in Gaza's war, allowing people to flee along 2 humanitarian corridors. Some of those escaping on Thursday said they feared another Nakba, the catastrophe of their mass dispossession after Israel was founded in 1948.
They are driving people to schools and scaring them so they would leave. What we see today is a plan for a second exodus.
What do things look like behind us? Death and destruction. Death and destruction.
US President Joe Biden says he's seeking a longer halt of 3 days to help secure the release of hostages held by Hamas.
We're hopeful. Things are moving along.
Israel unleashed its assault on Gaza in response to a cross-border raid by Hamas gunmen, who killed 1,400 people, mostly civilians, as well as kidnapping about 240. But the plight of Palestinians trapped in the besieged enclave has stoked global calls for a ceasefire, which is rejected by Israel and its main ally, the United States. Palestinian officials said more than 10,800 Gaza residents had been killed as of Thursday, about 40% of them children. At a humanitarian conference in Paris on Thursday, officials from about 80 countries and organisations were trying to coordinate a response. Jan Egeland heads the Norwegian Refugee Council.
We cannot wait a minute more for a humanitarian ceasefire across Gaza for all of the civilian population there. And we cannot wait a minute more for a lifting of the siege, which is collective punishment of 1 million children.
It's been more than a month since the fighting broke out and that October 7 onslaught at the hands of the Hamas terrorist organization. Meanwhile, the world currently stands really polarized. Are you anti-Palestine or are you pro-Palestine? Meanwhile, to put things a little bit into context, around 50 protesters demonstrated in Tel Aviv, these are Israelis, on Saturday evening, calling for a ceasefire as Israeli forces' assault on the Gaza Strip rages on. They said they were protesting the indiscriminate killing of civilians that have been seen in the past weeks by Hamas, by the IDF, both of them in the Gaza Strip. There were open calls for a ceasefire and the release of hostages alike. Placards read, "Ceasefire now," and "No winners in any war."
We are here to protest against the indiscriminate killing of civilians that we are seeing in the past weeks by Hamas and by the F in the Gaza Strip. We are calling for a ceasefire now and release of the hostages and going towards a solution to this never-ending bloodshed and continued killing.
If they're Palestinians, we want everyone that live inside the border and outside of it, whether it's within Israel, the Gaza Strip, or the West Bank, to live in peace and equality.
But it's not just about Israel, because pro-Palestinian protests have also been taking shape across the world, especially in the West. Take a look at this. Britons gathered to demand ceasefire in Gaza on Armistice Day, an important day across the United Kingdom. Protesters gathered at a pro-Palestinian march in London on Saturday to demand a ceasefire from Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Government ministers had called for Saturday's march to be cancelled because it fell on Armistice Day, which marks the end of the World War I and commemorates those killed in military action. British Interior Minister Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is already facing pressure to sack Braverman. Meanwhile, the Interior Minister, Suella Braverman, said that protesters were hate marchers. And these remarks attracted widespread criticism, but protesters said her words had the opposite effect. Now, Armistice Day is supposed to be about the end of the war, and this is exactly what people were there for. A protester was heard saying that they wanted to see an end to the war in Gaza, and this is what they were supporting.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire! What do we want? Ceasefire!
Meanwhile, take a look at this. Hundreds of protesters rallied outside the district office of Representative Uttar Clark in Flatbush, New York on Thursday, demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Protesters wrote the names of some of the over 4,000 Palestinian children that were killed by the Israeli military. Now, the White House said that Israel agreed to pause military operations in parts of North Gaza for 4 hours a day, but there was no sign of a let-up in the fighting that has killed thousands and laid waste to the seaside enclave.
Shut it down! Shut it down! Shut
Now, earlier, a small group of protesters, they scaled the Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh, waving Palestinian flags. A banner that was unfurled by the group at the building's entrance read, "Stop arming Israel." Britain has supported Israel's right to defend itself after the October 7th attack by the terrorist group Hamas that Israel said killed over 1,200 people, mostly civilians. Meanwhile, shifting our focus here, ladies and gentlemen, taking a look at what's happening back at home, what's happening on the political chessboard in terms of domestic politics, but more importantly, it is the auspicious occasion of Diwali. Let's take you through the latest stories that we're tracking. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he celebrated Diwali with the security forces stationed in Himachal Pradesh's Lepcha. Now, this is the 10th consecutive year that the Prime Minister is celebrating the festival with the soldiers. Some of those pictures that did in fact come out. That's the tweet on the microblogging website. His tweet read, "Reached Lepcha in Himachal Pradesh to celebrate Diwali with our brave security forces." This time as well, Prime Minister Narendra Modi celebrated Diwali with the soldiers. He reached Lepcha in Himachal Pradesh, bordering Nepal, this very morning and congratulated the soldiers on Diwali. Now, it's important to note here that after becoming the Prime Minister in 2014, Prime Minister Modi went to Siachen for the first time in that year. In 2022, he celebrated Diwali with soldiers in Kargil. This is the 10th consecutive Diwali that he's celebrating with the border security forces, with the Jawans that are safeguarding our border fronts. This time he went to Himachal's Lepcha. Only a few pictures that have trickled out. It's important to safeguard the Prime Minister's travelogue as well. Can't really specify where he's visiting, especially in sensitive areas that are closer to the border. Visited Himachal's Lepcha, congratulated the soldiers and our brave security forces. Meanwhile, that's not all. In a spectacular celebration of Diwali, the city of Ayodhya, and some stalking and spectacular visuals that came out of it, has illuminated the Guinness World Record by lighting over 22 lakh diyas during this year's Deepotsav 2023. Take a look at that. An aerial shot of Ayodhya and the Deepotsav 2023 celebrations. Last year, we had about 15 lakh diyas. This year, we've lit over 22 lakh diyas, lighting up the entirety of the Guinness Book of World Records as well. Breaking its record from last year, the temple town's luminous feet surpassed the previous record of over 15 lakh diyas that was set just last Diwali. Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath, along with the state governor and diplomats from around 54 countries, attended the grand Deepotsav 2023 celebrations. Also, Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath himself received the certificate from Guinness World Records, making this Diwali truly special for the entire country. And the good news doesn't end here, because amid the massive festivities, residents of Delhi and the National Capital Region finally seem to be celebrating Diwali like the way they should, and with a fresh breath of air. As the air quality index, it has shown massive signs of improvement. Still in the very poor category, but we've come a long, long way. After enduring several days of hazardous air, the city breathes fresh air thanks to the recent rainfall, according to the Met Department. However, the relief comes with a cautionary note. Does not mean we let our masks down, does not mean we let our guard down. It's still time to continue to pull our socks up. Despite the noticeable improvement, the overall air quality in the national capital is still categorized as poor. The smog has dissipated a little bit. The traffic and the implementation of the odd and even rule, that might not be happening, but people still need to be careful about prolonged exposure of PM 2.5 and PM 10 and other pollutants in the air out there. Next up, a story coming from our Mandate 2023 segment. It is, in fact, the semi-finals for the general elections 2024. 30th of this month, Telangana goes to polls. A story coming from that state. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the Madiga event in Telangana on Saturday, targeting the K. Chandrasekhar Rao government, beg your pardon. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the BRS government had backstabbed the Madigas and the Dalits in the state of Telangana. He said that even though the BRS promised a Dalit chief minister in Telangana, K. Chandrasekhar Rao himself became the chief minister after the state was created. Taking a jibe at the Congress, Prime Minister Modi said that the Congress and the BRS were cooperating in corruption and didn't do anything for the Dalit community.
आंदोलन के दिनों में आपसे वादा किया गया था कि किसी दलित को ही तेलंगाना का पहला सीएम बनाया जाएगा, लेकिन राज्य के निर्माण के बाद हर दलित आकांक्षाओं को कुचलते हुए सीएम की कुर्सी पर केसीआर ने कब्जा कर लिया। बीआरएस ने दलितों को जमीन देने का भी वादा किया था। क्या उन्होंने वादा पूरा किया? बीआरएस ने आपको दलित बंधु स्कीम के जरिए हजारों करोड़ रुपया देने की बात कही थी। क्या आपको इसका लाभ हुआ? सच्चाई ये है, ये स्कीम बीआरएस विधायकों के रिश्तेदारों की स्कीम बन गई है। कोर्ट तक को यह कहना पड़ा कि दलित बंधु स्कीम के लाभार्थियों का चयन निष्पक्ष होना चाहिए। यहां की सरकार ने किसानों के लोन माफ करने का भी वादा किया था, लेकिन किसानों को इसका भी लाभ नहीं मिला। यहां की सरकार ने इरिगेशन स्कीम्स के बदले आप लोगों को इरिगेशन स्कैम दिए हैं। भ्रष्टाचार के मामले में भी कांग्रेस और बीआरएस एक दूसरे से अलग नहीं है। भारत में सामान्य तौर पर अलग अलग राज्य विकास योजनाओं के लिए दूसरे राज्यों के साथ कोऑपरेशन करते हैं, लेकिन बीआरएस की सरकार ने दिल्ली की आम आदमी पार्टी के साथ मिलकर हजारों करोड़ रुपयों का शराब घोटाला कर दिया। ये लोग काम में नहीं, करप्शन में कोऑपरेशन करते हैं। और मैं तेलंगाना के लोगों को ये स्पष्ट तस्वीर भी देखने को कहूंगा। दिल्ली में कांग्रेस की कट्टर सहयोगी आम आदमी पार्टी के साथ मिलकर तेलंगाना की बीआरएस पार्टी कट्टर भ्रष्टाचार करती है और फिर यहां वही बीआरएस कांग्रेस के खिलाफ लड़ने का ड्रामा कर रही है। तेलंगाना के लोगों को इस दोहरेपन से भी बहुत सावधान रहना है।
Well, next up, shifting our focus to the top international developments that are coming up next. Spain's acting Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, he looks assured of another term in office. This after securing the backing of 2 more regional parties. But it comes amid widespread anger over his pledge of amnesty for Catalan separatists. But why are these protests becoming increasingly intense? Here's a report. Take a look.
Increasingly violent protests led by right-wing demonstrators have rocked Madrid in recent days over a widely unpopular deal between Spain's acting prime minister and Catalan separatists. The controversial deal will grant amnesty to separatist activists who attempted an illegal breakaway in 2017. In exchange, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez will get their support, paving the way for him to remain in power. But opposition leaders described it as giving into blackmail by independence leaders and a sign the country was veering back to a dictatorship. The Separatist Party's founder, Carles Puigdemont, who has been living in exile in Belgium and faces charges as a leader of Catalonia during the drive to secede, hailed the agreement as a change of narrative. After Sanchez's Socialist Party failed to clinch a majority in a July election, it was clear they would have to do a deal with smaller parties, including the hardline Catalan separatists, to gain the seats needed to form a government. Without their support, and with the vengeful opposition of the Conservative People's Party that controls the Senate, Sanchez's socialist could be paralyzed to pass legislation, including budgets, risking a vote of no confidence against him or the forcing of a snap election. Sanchez's conservative opponents have accused him of putting the rule of law on the line for his own political gain. Sanchez has secured the backing of 2 other regional parties, which all but assures him an absolute majority in the 350-member Congress in a vote due to take place in the coming days. Meanwhile, Spaniards have been called to show their outrage in town square demonstrations across the country on Sunday. One of the more divisive aspects of the amnesty deal protesters are upset with is that it would allow separatist leaders like Puigdemont to run for office again.
Well, now shifting our focus to Turkey, where a dispute between 2 of Turkey's top courts over a politician's imprisonment is raising concerns over the rule of law, with the Bar Association in the country denouncing it as an attempted coup. President Erdogan says the country needs a new constitution to restore order.
An unprecedented clash between 2 of the highest courts in Turkey over the imprisonment of a politician accused of trying to overthrow the government is raising concerns over the rule of law in that country. And on Friday, President Tayyip Erdogan waded into the fray, calling for a rewrite of the constitution to resolve the dispute. This was Erdogan telling Parliament the country needs a new constitution as soon as possible. The heart of the issue concerns a member of Parliament who was convicted to 18 years in prison last year for a role organizing these nationwide protests in 2013. He and other defendants have denied the charges, saying the protests happened spontaneously. The protests were one of the biggest challenges to Erdogan's power in his over 2 decades in office. Last month, the nation's highest court, the Constitutional Court, ruled that the politician should be released. His name is Can Atalay. An appeals court, known as the Court of Cassation, called the ruling unconstitutional and filed a criminal complaint against the members of the Constitutional Court. Erdogan has also called the ruling in favor of Atalay's release unconstitutional, and now the Turkish Bar Association, seen here protesting, is accusing the appeals court of an attempted coup. Turkey's main opposition party has joined the Bar Association in criticizing Erdogan, and the appeals court.
Meanwhile, with the winter setting in, the International Rescue Committee in Afghanistan expressed deep concern about the survival of tens of thousands of Afghan refugees arriving from Pakistan. Here's a report.
We're expecting people to continue arriving from Pakistan for around the next 6 months. And the crisis conditions that those people will face will remain for the long term. As you mentioned, we're facing winter, and conditions are going to deteriorate rapidly. Temperatures are going to drop significantly. And also in December, this marks the start of the rainy season. And so people are going to be bearing extremely difficult conditions. Like I said, they'll be sleeping in tents under open sky. The humanitarian needs at the Torkham Crossing are immense. We've seen up to 200,000 people arriving since the start of October, and many people are arriving from Pakistan with nothing but the clothes on their back. Many people have not lived here in Afghanistan for decades, and so are arriving with no support network. They have no money. I think it's important also to point out that, like I said, Afghanistan is still experiencing economic crisis, and the country cannot afford to absorb the thousands of families arriving, and it's likely that this is going to stretch the economy even further. So the situation for Afghanistan as a whole is also likely to deteriorate.
Moving on, SpaceX faces accusations of neglecting worker safety standards as investigated by Reuters. Now, over 600 injuries since 2014, including amputations, a fatality that have been uncovered. Reports reveal chaotic workplaces, high injury rates, and alleged indifference by CEO Elon Musk, challenging the company's safety assurances amid its ambitious space missions.
In the summer of 2021, Florentino Rios was working at SpaceX, Elon Musk's rocket company. Working about 25 feet off the ground, he signaled to the crane operator to stop moving, but his hand signal was missed. The operator tried to move a beam after it was fixed in place, causing a chain to snap and strike Rios in the face.
I couldn't see anything anymore, so I yelled to my friend, "I lost my eye, I lost my eye," and he didn't answer because he was also hit.
Rios went to the hospital that night. Days later, doctors told him he had lost vision in the eye. He was now legally blind and could no longer drive or work construction. SpaceX, he says, should have equipped the team with walkie-talkies and better lighting at the site.
What I saw while doing this work at SpaceX is that it wasn't safe enough. It wasn't.
Rios isn't the only seriously injured SpaceX worker. A Reuters investigation found the company has disregarded worker safety regulations and standard practices for years. Through government records and interviews, Reuters documented more than 600 injuries since 2014. Many were serious or disabling. They included lacerations, broken bones, crushed hands, and head injuries. 8 accidents led to amputations. 1 employee died in 2014. Lonnie LeBlanc died from a head injury after being blown off a trailer by a gust of wind at the SpaceX facility in McGregor, Texas. SpaceX did not respond to detailed questions from Reuters for this report. The company has defended its safety practices in responses to government inspections. It says it provides workers extensive safety training. Reuters spoke to 36 people with knowledge of SpaceX safety practices, including current or former employees. They say its high injury rates reflect a chaotic workplace. Undertrained and overtired staff routinely skipped basic safety procedures as they raced to meet Musk's aggressive deadlines for space missions.
Any predictions on when Starship might land on Mars without crew, maybe a crewed flight? Any prediction there?
I think 3 or 4 years.
4 years.
SpaceX takes the stance that workers are responsible for protecting themselves. That's according to more than a dozen current and former employees, including a former senior executive. Musk himself could appear cavalier about safety on visits to company sites. 4 employees said the CEO, on his visits to a California rocket factory, sometimes played with a novelty flamethrower that shoots a thick flame 5 or 10 feet long. He also discouraged workers from wearing safety yellow because he hates bright colors. Since Musk co-founded the rocket company in 2002, SpaceX has achieved major breakthroughs, including becoming the first private company to send humans into orbit. It now employs about 13,000 people. The more than 600 SpaceX injuries that Reuters documented represent only a portion of the total case count. The U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, started requiring companies to report their total number of injuries annually in 2016. 6 major SpaceX facilities across the U.S. failed to submit reports for many of those years. Reuters reviewed OSHA violation records on SpaceX and found no agency sanctions for its data reporting failures. For violations it found following accidents, the agency levied only small fines. In one case, SpaceX paid a $7,000 OSHA fine for violations resulting in a worker's death. OSHA said it has recently heightened scrutiny on all companies, but the agency did not comment on its enforcement decisions regarding SpaceX. Jordan Barab is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of OSHA.
Pushing workers to do dangerous work, regardless of their knowledge that the work is dangerous, essentially shows that this company is putting its profits ahead of worker safety and putting its profits ahead of worker health and workers' lives.
After losing his eyesight, Rios sued SpaceX. He alleged the company's negligence caused the injury by failing to implement or follow worker safety procedures. The company, in court records, argued that Rios' own negligence was to blame.
It's a
very sad thing because, unfortunately, well, I'm the one who supports my children, and it has totally changed everything for me. It's too much. I feel incomplete because I used to be someone who didn't like sitting around. I worked day and night to give my children what they needed. And now I can't. Now I feel very sad because wherever I want to go, I need help.
Necesito ayuda.
Well, next up, stories from our segment that focuses on global climate stories. Well, now, European Space Agency Chief Joseph Ashbacher warned that the melting of polar ice caps and glaciers is very critical and called on political leaders from around the world to recognize the importance of climate change. Here's a report.
The situation at the poles is very critical. We have, of course, we see with our satellites day and night how big the melting of the polar regions is, but also what is the impact on sea level rise. We have some of the most accurate satellite measurements to see how the sea level is rising due to melting of polar regions, glaciers and so on. Well, what I really expect and hope for, but this is more as a private citizen because it's for the politicians to really implement these actions, is to recognize the importance of climate change, what has to be done to really do everything that is necessary to decarbonize our economy and become carbon neutral by mid of this century. And there, again, you have all the support from the space agencies. The European Space Agency is spending a significant amount of its funding. About 1/4 of our budget is dedicated to Earth observation, which is mostly focusing on climate activities. And yes, we fully support these initiatives with the means we have at our disposal.
Well, that's all the time we have for you in this edition of Top Stories. Lots more continues right on the other side. Don't go anywhere. News 9 big coverage of 5 assembly polls. Mandate 2023. Hamas attacks Israel. Israel Defense Forces strike back at Hamas. As the war unfolds, watch the comprehensive coverage of the Israel war only on News 9 Plus. To watch the full story, download the app now.
Literally every major power in the world is gearing up with its own digital currency. And so is India. But India's UPI has taken digital transactions to the next level. So, with UPI already available, what exactly is the use case for the e-rupee?
This and more streaming on world's first news OTT. News 9 Plus, download now.